on his way. He's filled his sleigh with things for you and for me. It's that time of year when the world falls in love. Every song you hear seems to say, Merry Christmas. May your New Year's dreams come true. And this song of mine in 3/4 time wishes you and yours the same thing too.
Merry Christmas, everyone, and a Happy New Year. It's that time of year again where we're supposed to gather around the fire, surrounded by the ones we love, and engage in millennia-old traditions around gift-giving and warding off the darkness of winter. Well, it's supposed to feel like it's that time of year, but I'm sure for a lot of people out there, including myself, it really doesn't. Loneliness is already an epidemic in this post-industrial age, and the advent of COVID-19 will likely leave many of us isolated this winter and socially distancing from the ones we love, which is really sad. It's also pretty sad that when a lot of people think about the political left, they associate it with anti-family stances. Abolish the family is a phrase constantly repeated by people who call themselves leftists in places like academia, the media, and in activist organizations like Black Lives Matter. This phrase is constantly used without any thought as to how the average person who has no exposure to political theory might find it confusing or downright abhorrent. So, does the left really want to abolish the family? Or is there something insidious about what family has become under capitalism? Does family under capitalism really mean mommy, daddy, brother, sister? Or does it mean something that's actually coercive and detrimental to family love and social bonds? Marx, Engels, and many other theorists published criticisms on the ideological function of the family. But these theories and postulations have been heavily misconstrued by those all over the political spectrum, because they often represent these critiques as an attack on natural or traditional kinship structures. To unpick some of the confusion, we'll have to go back in time to the prehistoric era, where humans lived in what theorist Friedrich Engels called a promiscuous horde, or tribe, in which the sexual limitations of monogamy and the traditional family structure were rare. Engels theorized that early human society existed in a primitive communism, where private property, the means of production, hunting and gathering, and distribution were owned by all. There are a lot of misconceptions about Marxist language, especially around the idea of private property. A lot of people seem to think that private property and personal possessions are the same thing. In Marxist terms, private property is property that can be used to generate profit, like land, machines, etc. Early humans obviously owned personal property, but the concept of private property and class society didn't yet exist. So yeah, I don't own your gaming console under communism or anything like that, and you still get your Christmas gifts. It was not until the advent of agricultural societies, and then eventually city-states, that the concept of private ownership evolved new material conditions, and this drastically shifted how family structures manifested. Agricultural societies generated vast amounts of wealth and resources, which eventually translated into private ownership of land and the inception of class society. The family structure was absorbed into a system of economic relations that necessitated the traditional monogamous pairing of men and women to ensure paternity and facilitate the inheritance of private property and land. Of course, traditional bonds naturally form, and obviously men and women come together and form families. What Marxists criticize is the economic forces which invade these natural processes. The traditional family structure developed to facilitate the desire to pass on prosperity and maintain the class position of communities and clans. Think about why House Stark, for instance, from Game of Thrones, was so keen on marrying Sansa to Joffrey, despite how much of a little shit he was. Not to mention House Lannister's treachery. The paternity of children gained more significance and was assured through things like monogamy and marriage, which eventually facilitated patriarchal dominance. The productive labor of women became entwined within patriarchal structures through economic coercion, limiting women's sexuality to the mere instrument of production of children. The concept of the modern nuclear family did not yet exist at this point in history. Even though families usually consisted of the traditional monogamous pairing, they were also made up of close kinship groups of extended family, like relatives, in-laws, etc., that often lived in close proximity with one another. It wasn't until the industrial era of capitalism where we started to see family structures atomized down to what we would now call the nuclear family. Industrial capitalism was yet another major shift in the productive power of human civilization, and capitalism's material conditions and demands created an even greater shift in the makeup of the family structure. The atomized nuclear family, divorced from extended social bonds, became the perfect unit of ideological reproduction and consumption for the capitalist order. Entire populations of the rural agricultural classes, displaced by land enclosures and the economic pressures of the emerging industrial age, flocked to cities and industrial centers in search of wage labor to support themselves and their families. The early period of capitalism saw people living in cities, away from their extended families, and atomized down to their most efficient yet basic units to benefit the capitalist system. In order to support wage laborer husbands, women were largely tasked with the domestic duties of child rearing and creating a comfortable environment for a singular breadwinner to return to after a hard day on the job. So, to simplify, early humanity and the advent of private property saw the natural bonds of the family transformed into a social contract about the inheritance of wealth and private property. But then the capitalist order comes along and exacerbates this by transforming the family into the ultimate unit of production in society and also a unit for the manufacturing of ideological consent. From a Marxist perspective, this hijacking of the family does very little to actually strengthen or help our social bonds. It benefits capitalism and puts extra pressure on our social bonds through isolation and capitalist mediation. For instance, during the Reagan and Thatcher era, the individual and the family became the primary units of neoliberal capitalism. Therefore, the blame for all the ills of society, including things like poverty and crime, were shifted onto the family unit and away from government and other authorities. The bourgeois family, shaped by the logic of the capitalist system, which is interested in the production of efficient workers and the generation of profit, evolved out of a growing middle class. The ability to provide material comfort, education, and other class privileges to a growing number of children, and the pressure to keep up appearances and maintain class position through property ownership, inheritance, consumer goods, and so on, eventually culminated into the development of the nuclear family, an ideological reproduction of the bourgeoisie unit. The bourgeois family became the common mode, which is why Marxists argued for abolition of the family. This was because, in their view, the proletariat was forced to ape the mechanics of the bourgeois family by transforming their natural familial bonds into unnatural units of consumption, production, and inheritance in a way that benefits the capitalist system. So, to sum it up in simple terms, leftists are not against people having or enjoying families. I mean, I'm sure there are some people out there who call themselves leftists that are actually in favor of destroying families. But this has nothing to do with Marxist theory and everything to do with their own traumas, anxieties, and projections around the subject. And I don't say that to be flippant. The atomized capitalist bourgeois family has done a lot of psychological damage to society because it's not the natural way that we would choose to organize ourselves or live. What Marxists are really saying when we make critiques of the nuclear family is that it is a unit based upon economic coercion and relationships that distorts the meaning of family bonds into something atomized and functional for the system, rather than something freely chosen and genuinely supportive. Families coming together is not unnatural or entirely based upon economic coercion. However, what is unnatural is economic systems hijacking our social bonds and turning them into units for the extraction of value. Marxists support the family as a unit of society and want an economic system that supports more than just a unit of consumption and production. From extended tribal networks to friendships to non-traditional family structures, Marxists desire the family to retain its natural and free-flowing form, rather than having it be a system of economic coercion. The epidemic of loneliness in post-industrial capitalist nations indicates that yet another shift in our kinship structures is on the horizon. As our economic models shift and we move further away from the industrial labor of the past to alienated office work, the gig economy, the service sector, along with the advancement of communication technology, the atomized individual has now replaced the already atomized nuclear family as the primary unit of consumption and ideological reproduction for the capitalist hegemony. Yes, that's right. The atomized individual is now the main subject of the system. The nuclear family is no longer needed for anything other than the reproduction of workers. Labor shortages during the major world wars saw women, the once solely reproductive class, introduced into the mostly male-dominated workplace. The advancement of women's rights largely hinged upon our utility as workers in shifting capitalist conditions. Women are particularly under pressure now to make difficult choices around maintaining autonomy, economic independence, and avoiding subservience to the family, at the expense of the desire for some to start families and create social bonds. On average, people are marrying much later than previous generations and having less kids, if any at all, mainly due to major economic constraints. The social commons are also largely dominated by capitalist mediation, including the ways we create bonds with others, foster a sense of community, and we are inundated by a marketplace full of distractions and consumption choices, which are formulated to simulate or replace social bonds we would typically create on our own. We are catered to as individual consumers that are presented with multiple ways of customizing reality and also keeping ourselves isolated from it. The thing that actually wants to abolish the family is the capitalist system, and many of the people today who call themselves leftists are infested with its logic. This is why you see so many so-called leftists celebrating these atomizing trends and yelling slogans like "Abolish the Family" without any real forethought grounded in theory. It's so silly and an example of one of the many ways the left unwittingly does the bidding of the capitalist system. The neoliberal utopia is on the horizon. It is a version of the future that promises self-actualization through individual striving and cultivation. However, these promises are hollow. Capitalist individualism has nothing to do with the pursuit of self-impelled actualization. The individualistic ethos of the system only exists to further atomize us into productive units as it sees fit. We are in the process of being conditioned to accept this new normal, and we see the generation of justifying ideologies for this trend emerging all around us. The ideological production that justifies the current hegemony no longer needs to be filtered through the family structure when it can be delivered directly to the individual through mediation. By carelessly screaming slogans like "Abolish the Family" at people, we are given the implication that we are explicitly for the severing of important social bonds in so many people's lives. And yes, many people do live in situations where the nuclear family was abusive or detrimental in some way, and many fetishize the destruction of such a unit as their response to trauma. But the left is not here to tell people how to live. We are here to fight for the conditions for people to live as they please. That means that some people will have families based around monogamy, some will be polyamorous, and some are not going to pursue any form of romance or family at all. The point is not to say something is bad and then advocate the opposite. The point is to empower people with real choices by undoing economic and societal coercion. When we moralize, enforce, and oversimplify, we are unwittingly doing the work of capitalist ideological reproduction and creating a moral cover for a system that wants us further atomized. We are also living in a very isolating period of history, and the last thing we would want to communicate to people is that we're somehow in favor of further eroding our already fragile social bonds. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The left is very bad at communicating ideas. I think part of the reason this is the case is because the left has traditionally set itself up in opposition to traditional structures, rather than developing an authentic personality. The capitalist system is an expert at adaptation and recuperation, so it is inevitable that the language of the left can be used to manufacture consent for a new order of atomized consumers. We need to put the social back into socialist, the commune back into communism. The family is one of the most important units of society, and if we allow its contours to be defined by unhinged radical liberals, a neoliberal system that's atomizing, or right-wing traditionalism, then we are doing the historical struggle a great disservice. During the dark winter months, for thousands of years, humans have created elaborate rituals like Yule and Saturnalia and Christmas as we know it today, as ways of warding off the darkness and celebrating togetherness and light. So this year, hold on tight to the ones that you love, and try not to let the darkness win. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I hope you all have a great Christmas and a happy new year. I know that things are not normal this year at all, so I hope that everyone's doing their best to sort of stay warm and safe this winter season. I'd like to thank all my Patreons as well for supporting me through this year and many other previous years. I really appreciate all of your support. You guys make this whole thing possible. So if you'd like to join my Patreon and support the channel, there's a link to that in the description. I also have merch, tarot themed merch as well, so if you want to check that out, there's also a link to that in the description. That's also a way that you can support the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I also don't get very much algorithmic help, so you guys sharing my videos always helps, and it makes a huge difference. Thank you guys for watching, and I shall see you later. Goodbye!